Please, a warm welcome for Mr. Mark Plamondon.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation to join you here today. And, it's really wonderful to be in person in a conference. It's been a couple of years for me and probably a couple of years for everybody here where we've been in a big room like this together. So great to be here. So thank you for joining me. Most of you are down here, so I'm going to try to talk to everybody in the room, but I might be looking this way more than over here, but not trying to ignore you. It's a big space. So the plan here is I have about an hour, and the plan is I'm going to walk through some slides for, I'll keep an eye on the time, maybe 45 minutes, and then there'll be a microphone available, and let's have a bit of a dialogue around maybe if you have some questions or have some comments around what's happening and questions around how Alberta's industrial heartland may be impacted by current activities and current happenings in the world. Be happy to try to give you some comments or my insights on anything. So let's have a bit of a dialogue here today. So my talk is on Alberta's industrial heartland. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes talking specifically about that, some macro trends in the world and how I think the industrial heartland is positioned to take advantage of some of these macro trends. So for those, and some of this, some of you may be very familiar with Alberta's industrial heartland and what's happening there, and some of you maybe not so much. So hopefully I can provide some additional color for those who maybe this is old hat, and hopefully it's informative for those who don't know much about Alberta's industrial heartland. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the heartland, what it is, and I'm going to start with the association. So Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association, we are an association of municipalities. So it's a nonprofit association, and we are we represent 5 municipalities: the City of Edmonton, City of Fort Saskatchewan, Strathcona County, Sturgeon County, and Lamont County. And we have 3 associate members, the towns of Gibbons, Redwater, and Bruderheim. And these municipalities, they formed this association in the mid-90s, specifically with an intent to work collaboratively towards economic development, investment attraction, basically recognizing that when you're on the world stage and you're talking about large-scale value-add energy investments, and you're looking to attract large investments to the region, doing that in a collaborative fashion is much more effective than by individual municipalities. And so that was the intent of the 5 municipalities joining together, forming this association, really to work collectively to attract investment to the area. And so our association is organized sort of in 4 distinct pillars, but really with the underlying mandate, to drive investment and economic development of Alberta's industrial heartland. So our main reason to be is that investment attraction. So we have a business development team, and they are the main team that travels the world, works with companies around the world to help them understand as quickly as possible the infrastructure and the competitive advantages of Alberta's industrial heartland when they are looking at their next capital investment. So we conduct a variety of studies, base cases, hosting investor tours, in-market marketing activities. We attend numerous conferences around the world to work to meet companies and hopefully, get them interested in what Alberta's industrial heartland has to offer, so that when they're looking at their next capital project, our jurisdiction is the jurisdiction that is being considered. And as you know, capital is mobile. Large-scale companies can put their capital in probably anywhere in the world. Most countries would be happy to have these type of investments, given the significant amount of construction activity that happens for large-scale investments, plus the fact that they're typically in the ground for decades and decades. There's a huge economic spin-off for decades to come, and so there's competition for this capital. And so we want, when companies are looking at various jurisdictions, that our jurisdiction is one that is considered and hopefully ultimately chosen as a destination of choice for their capital investment. We also recognize that you can have the greatest marketing program in the world, where you're out in the world talking about your jurisdiction and what it has to offer, but if what you're offering, if the product itself is not competitive or not attractive, you're not going to get a whole lot of investment. So we recognize that there's a 2-pronged approach here. We have a marketing program to promote the region, but we also have a government relations team that is working with the federal and provincial government continuously to help them understand the importance of the region and the energy value chain and what's happening in the area. And then hopefully that then morphs into policy that is conducive and helpful for investment in our area. So we're trying to improve the region and improve our product so that when we're marketing the product, we have a product that actually is competitive and seen by investors as a destination of choice for them. So we have a government relations team that's working with governments to try to help improve the region. We have people focused on infrastructure and infrastructure planning, largely to identify where there's pinch points in infrastructure in the area, with the intent, of course, to improve the overall competitiveness of our region so that when companies are looking at their investment, again, the industrial heartland stacks up as a competitive jurisdiction. And then we also have somebody in our shop that's focused on communications and community relations. And you know, that, again, all is really to support investment. If you think about large-scale investors, when they're looking at where they want to put their capital investment, having a region where the community is supportive of that investment is a huge asset. And obviously, it's much easier to convince folks to invest capital in large-scale projects if the community is welcoming and interested in their project, as opposed to a community that is confrontational or not interested in companies being here. And that's not the case in the industrial heartland, but we don't take that for granted. That takes a lot of work. So we have somebody focused on community relations that works in partnerships with other stakeholders and with the industry in the area to continuously facilitate dialogue between community and industry so that we have support for additional investment in the region. And so Alberta's industrial heartland itself, this is the geography of what it looks like. So in red here, we have the 5 municipalities, and then the black area, 582 square kilometers, is the geographical location of Alberta's industrial heartland. So it spans those 5 municipalities. So 582 square kilometers of flat land that is mostly pre-zoned for heavy industrial development. It is a huge area with significant land holdings for additional development. So right now, there's over $45 billion of investments in the ground. Over 40 companies, 23 of these companies are world-scale large companies that operate in the region. Just the regional spend amongst those companies is almost $3 billion, and of course, the number of jobs produced in this region is substantial. Well over 30,000 direct and indirect jobs in this region. So it is an economic driver for the region, the province, and the country, and it is Canada's largest hydrocarbon processing center. So it's really grown to be an economic engine for the country, and I think there's tremendous opportunity here that I'll be talking about here as we go forward through the talk. And I'm quite optimistic about the future here for this region. So lots of excitement happening. But currently, what are the assets that are in the industrial heartland? And a lot of you, I'm sure, work in this region and are familiar with it. For those who are not, there's significant assets right now, as I said, over $45 billion. On the right of this slide, you know, we're talking about the oil assets here. So there's significant bitumen upgrading and refining assets. About half, I haven't figured out the exact dollar amount, but about half the capital in the ground is probably towards oil, bitumen upgrading and refining. And then there's significant petrochemical type investments, your downstream gas and NGL processing, so ethylene and polyethylene production, propylene, monoethylene glycol, isooctane, styrene monomer, all your sort of petrochemical and chemicals processing that's here, and a significant amount of fertilizer production, so urea, ammonium sulfate, ammonia production in the region. And then there's other assets in the industrial heartland. You know, there's specialty chemicals, some specialty productions of finished nickel and cobalt powders and coatings, as well as all the midstream utilities infrastructure to support all of these assets that are here. So, you know, a significant amount of companies operating assets that are in the ground and world-scale companies that are here. So these are companies that are active in the area. You would recognize all of them. World-scale companies, good corporate citizens, and certainly we've created this industry, along with the municipalities, have created this industrial cluster here that continues to benefit from economies of scale, as you'd imagine. So the The outputs from one facility can become the inputs to another. The competitive advantage for one facility then can become a competitive advantage for the next facility. And you continue to grow this cluster that has economic benefits as well as a lower environmental footprint than you'd have if all of these assets were standalone facilities spread across the province or the country. So that's the industrial heartland, just in a bit of a snapshot there. I want to talk for a few minutes about the global macro trends that I'm seeing and that we're seeing in the heartland that we think the industrial heartland is well positioned to capture. So the first is robust growth for petrochemical products. So petrochemical products grow about 1.5% above GDP typically, historically. And so that's pretty significant. With GDP growth comes additional consumerism, particularly growth in the middle class. This drives consumption of petrochemical products, and you continue to see significant demand for petrochemical products. Again, about 1.5% above GDP. We would expect between now and 2030, about a 45% increase, or through 2020 to 2030, about a 45% increase in total petrochemical demands globally. So that's a substantial increase in demand for petrochemical products, which means companies that are in this industry are continuously looking for their next project. Where are we going to put our next facility that is going to provide the supply that is going to meet this growing demand? And if you think about where this demand is coming from, as the middle class grows, particularly in India and China, there's a significant amount of middle class growth in those countries that will continue to drive consumerism and continue to drive demand for these products. And so we think the industrial heartland is very well positioned to meet the growth of global demand for petrochemical products. And I'll talk a little bit about the cost advantages of producing here in the industrial heartland, but certainly, as the world is looking to grow and meet the demand for petrochemical products, when you're in an environment of really high oil prices, your feedstocks for petrochemical products from oil becomes less competitive, and your feedstocks that we have here in Western Canada from natural gas and natural gas liquids becomes even more competitive. So really strong macro trend here for petchem demand, and our competitiveness just continues to improve as oil prices globally are elevated as they are today. A second trend that you hear about all the time is the energy transition towards a low carbon and net zero economy. So, what does that mean for our jurisdiction? Well, one comment I want to make is the IEA, the International Energy Agency, I think it was last year, came out with a report on a special report on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And they basically concluded that the world will not meet its net zero ambitions by 2050 without CCUS as a key pillar of that overall strategy. And that makes really good sense. If you think about all of the assets that are producing carbon emissions in the world right now, the amount of time it takes not only to develop new technologies and commercialize new technologies, but just capital stock turnover, right? Capital stock turnover takes a long time, and so if there's a way to capture the emissions out of large emitters globally, or particularly in our region, that is one significant step to reducing the overall GHG footprint. And so this is one trend that we think Alberta is very well positioned for. So we're very fortunate in Alberta, right? So the geology, about, over a kilometer below the surface, we have this sandstone layer, the basal Cambrian sandstone layer that is, almost perfect for carbon capture, for carbon storage, CO2 storage. It's at a pressure and temperature that's perfect for supercritical storage of CO2. And it extends mostly across most of Alberta and Saskatchewan, a little tiny bit into Manitoba and northern United States. But this geological layer could store over 1,000 years of production of CO2 emissions at current rate. So that's a huge storage sink sitting below the ground here in Alberta. So Alberta is very well positioned for carbon capture capability. And so you have this incredible sort of geological capability here that as this trend continues to grow globally and consumers and capital markets and everybody is looking for lower carbon products, having a region where a lot of the CO2 can be captured and stored below the surface, positions our region to be able to participate in this energy transition towards a net zero economy. The pace at which this happens, I guess we'll see, but certainly Alberta is very well positioned. The government of Alberta is looking right now at awarding CCUS hub operator status, where you would have a region awarded to a specific company or a group of companies to provide CCUS operator capability. And this, I think, fits very well in positioning Alberta to participate in this macro trend as we go forward. Third trend we're seeing at the moment is this, I'm going to say, post-COVID economic recovery and onshoring. And this became much more apparent during the pandemic, right? So if you think about the last 2 to 3 decades, we've had relatively stable global, I'm going to say geopolitical peace, if we can say that, relatively. Of course, there's always pockets of uncertainty, and what we have going on right now is certainly a bit of a game changer. But over the last 2 to 3 decades, you've had reasonable stability, and you've had incredible growth of the global supply chain and interconnectivity, globalization. And so these supply chains have grown, driven primarily by the most economic way to develop these supply chains. But what's happened over 2 to 3 decades? What's grown is we've got pockets of the world that has absolute dominance in production of certain materials. So over half of the cobalt chemical production in the world is in one geographical area. The vast majority of semiconductor production is in one geographical area. Over half of the world's petrochemical production is in one, and consumption is in one geographical area. So you get concentrations of production and the supply chain in one geographical area, and then COVID hits, and you have disruptions to that supply chain, and countries realize, oh, wait a sec, we're not very well diversified geographically for our overall inputs to our economy. And, geographical diversification is a form of insurance. As you know, it may not be the most economic way of doing things, but when you need it, you really need it. Just like insurance for your home or whatever. You pay into it annually and you don't like paying into it, but when you need that insurance, you really need that insurance. And I think particularly here in North America, in the United States, is they're recognizing that, wait a sec, our geographical diversification for some of the critical inputs that we need for our economy, it's not very good. And so they're looking for more onshoring and more diversification of some of these products. And so Canada is very well positioned to provide some of these products to the United States. So if you think about critical minerals, refined materials for battery production, and even the petrochemicals, we are well positioned to help the United States with the onshoring trend that we're starting to see in the conversations that are happening in the U.S. So that's a trend we're seeing, and again, I think Alberta and Alberta's industrial heartland is well positioned to participate in some of these investments. And another trend that we're seeing is conversations and around plastic circularity, and again, capital markets and consumers are demanding some solutions to the plastics waste problem that we have in the world. And plastics production and consumption is expected to grow from about 260 million tons today to about 700 million tons by 2050. So, again, this growth in petrochemical products demand and demand for supply of plastics, that's going to grow and grow. And so the plastics waste issue becomes more and more important to resolve. And it's recognized by consumers, it's recognized by governments, it's recognized by industry that the plastics waste challenge is significant and needs to be managed. And so the circular economy, where plastics are recycled and then using chemical processing, mechanical as well as chemical processing, to get plastics waste back into the economy and reused again as feedstocks, this whole circularity is going to be very important going forward. The industrial heartland is positioned in a way to participate in this. There's certain technologies that may work in our region, given the assets that are there right now and the feedstocks that are used right now. There's hopefully a way to participate in this. I'm going to be honest with this, though. There is some challenges. I mean, the majority of plastic waste is produced by consumers. And so that's produced in densely populated areas is where the majority of plastic waste is. And so Alberta is not densely populated, as you know. And so getting plastic waste feedstocks transported to Alberta is a bit of an economic challenge, and so will become part of the overall economic calculation that companies do to see how well the industrial heartland can participate. But certainly there will be growing demand, by society as a whole to ensure that the plastics waste problem is resolved. And one potential opportunity is the chemical recycling component, of which when you have assets already in the ground here, hopefully there's vertical integration opportunities. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing globally that we think the industrial heartland is positioned to take advantage of. But why would we be able to take advantage of that, or what are the advantages of the industrial heartland that we're seeing that positions us so well? So I want to talk about some of the attractive, some of the real attractive competitive factors that we have here in the industrial heartland. The first and foremost is access to abundant resources. So these natural gas plays, the Montney, the Duvernay, these are world-class assets. And there's over 200 years of natural gas in the ground at current production rates, over 100 years of propane. There is lots of resource. We're not running out anytime soon. It is a world-class asset that can provide resources for decades and in some cases centuries to come. And that positions Alberta very well. But as you know, you may have resources in the ground, but it really comes down to price. So what's the cost of that resource for consumers in order to make it a competitive advantage? And that's what makes, I think, our region a little bit unique. I want to talk a little bit about the market and how the interconnectivity between the bitumen and the oil sands and the energy space here in Alberta with the rest of North America, how that creates a structural advantage for our region. And this graph here is just a graph of the C5 plus demand, your pentanes plus demand, which is diluent and condensate in your natural gas stream. So natural gas out of the ground consists of a variety of components, right? The majority is methane, around 90% plus is methane. And then you've got ethane, propane, butane, and your pentanes plus. Those pentanes plus, that condensate is used as diluent in the oil sands. And you see growth of consumption of diluent. We're consuming now in Western Canada about 800,000 barrels a day of this diluent, which is used with, of course, when you're pumping your oil sands products, diluent is used to help with the viscosity to drive that product through the pipelines. So you've had this tremendous growth in demand for this diluent. So if you think about the market, there's 800,000 barrels a day of diluent being consumed, of which 200,000 barrels a day is imported. So you need to import this diluent from the United States. Okay, you need to import it. So what do I need to pay for that? Well, there's the price of diluent in the Gulf Coast plus transportation to get it here. So the pricing on diluent is Gulf Coast plus a premium pricing. And the most profitable component of the natural gas stream for drillers in Western Canada here is that condensate and diluent. And so that drives, it's the natural sort of economic cycle here, that drives investment and activity around wet gas. And so there's been a tremendous move towards drilling in areas that are rich in the wet gas and in natural gas liquids. And so you've seen a shift over the last 15 years of your natural gas production into the northwestern portion of Alberta, into the Grand Prairie, Fort St. John region, which is driven by access to this component, which adds to the profitability for natural gas producers. And so you have diluent being produced for the oil sands, and then it results in sort of the surplus of methane, ethane, propane that you now need to move to North American markets, again, primarily the United States markets. So you now need to move, let's say, your propane to the Gulf Coast. Okay, great. So what does that mean? That means Gulf Coast pricing of propane less the transportation cost to get it there. So propane is priced at Gulf Coast pricing less transportation on average. Of course, there's always some fluctuations based on temperatures and inventories, but in general, your propane is Gulf Coast at a discount. Your natural gas is Gulf Coast at a discount. And so you have these discounts for natural gas and ethane and propane that creates this competitive advantage here in Western Canada. If you're a petrochemical facility and you're going to take propane and you're going to upgrade it to propylene and then to polypropylene, your largest single operating cost is your feedstock, propane. And if that is at a huge discount, that is a tremendous competitive advantage for our region. So I take propane pricing in Alberta. I just take the average monthly numbers for the last 5 years versus the average monthly numbers in Mount Bellevue, and you have about a 30 to 35% discount here in Western Canada versus Gulf Coast. That is a huge competitive advantage for companies that want to build a petrochemical facility. Likewise, just for straight natural gas. I take the monthly AECO pricing versus Gulf Coast, you're between 40 and 45% discount monthly on average over the last 5 years. And again, if you're building a facility that's going to take methane and upgrade that to hydrogen, or methane and take that to methanol, having your number one operating cost component at a 40 to 45% discount is a huge competitive advantage for our region. And so the energy markets are all interconnected, but we have this sort of structural advantage here with the markets for these products, the market being made in the US, discounts needed to get products to market, creating this sort of natural competitive advantage here for our products, for companies that need to consume methane, ethane, or propane to upgrade to their petrochemical products to meet global demand. So it really positions us very well, and I'm going to maybe I'll jump to this slide. It illustrates it a little bit better. This here is just the price of propane, and this is since 2015. The blue line is United States, orange is Edmonton. The gray bar at the bottom is the differential, and that's your discount. And we would expect going forward there, again, to be sort of this continued discount on propane pricing in Western Canada relative to Gulf Coast. So you're a large-scale global petrochemical company, and you're looking at jurisdictions around the world where you want to put your facility, and you look at all factors, all costs, et cetera. But when you're looking at your number one operating cost, which is your feedstock, probably the most attractive jurisdiction from a feedstock cost standpoint is going to be in Western Canada. Certainly in North America. And we do know that, the United States is able to put energy products into the world competitively. They are the largest exporters of propane. They move LNG globally into global markets. So the pricing globally for energy products is sufficient to be able to move these products into the world. And so within North America, if Alberta is well-positioned within North America, then we know we're well-positioned globally. So really, I'm really optimistic about how we stand in terms of pricing. This graph, the second set of bars in is some ethane production estimates. Ethane is not a transparent market like natural gas is, of course, but we know that we have some of the lowest cost ethane in the world as well from some modeling that we've done. The second bars indicate that. So compared to other feedstocks and other jurisdictions in the world, again, we think our jurisdiction is the lowest cost, some of the lowest cost ethane in the world. And so you've got the lowest cost methane, ethane, propane, that really positions us well for these types of petrochemical investments that would utilize these feedstocks to meet growing demand. So that's the feedstock story. So we think that positions us well. And then, I've talked about this trend towards low carbon products. So there's global push for companies to have a lower carbon footprint for their products. Now, how this develops going forward, who knows? But it's quite possible that, companies are able to differentiate their product by their carbon footprint and be able to either get a premium or at least get market share associated with being a lower carbon footprint product. And so the carbon capture and storage infrastructure that's in the heartland. So right now there's two projects, the CCUS projects. Of course, the Shell Quest has been operating, I think, since 2016, about 1 million tons a year. And the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, owned by Wolf, and the Enhanced Energy has the utilization and storage for enhanced oil recovery. These assets are already in the ground, and the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line is operating at about 10% capacity. So you have assets and capacity in the ground right now that can take a high concentration, high volume CO2 stream that, again, puts us in this jurisdiction where companies can produce low cost, low carbon products. And as the world moves towards demanding lower carbon footprint for their products or the things that they buy, this, I think, positions us very well. And again, as technology advances and the world, starts to command or demand or be willing to pay a premium for these specific types of products, I think Alberta is very well positioned, and the CCUS infrastructure helps with that. So there's other infrastructure in the industrial heartland that works very well. 2 Class 1 railways. The rail systems through the industrial heartland will access Pacific Coast into the central U.S., down to the Gulf Coast, Atlantic Coast if needed. So product can be moved from the industrial heartland into the manufacturing belt in the United States competitively with coming up from the U.S. Gulf Coast. So we know that our rail assets can get us there competitively compared to U.S. Gulf Coast. We know that our feedstock is significantly advantaged. And so we think just overall the whole story from an economic standpoint stands up very well for the industrial heartland. And then you add on top of that the export capability. So any new company coming into the industrial heartland, they're looking to build a facility that's going to export their product, okay? Most of the products in the heartland are exported. Anyone new coming in is likely going to be exporting their product. You're either exporting to the US or you're exporting into most likely Asian markets. And again, our position in terms of shipping days from Rupert or Vancouver relative to, say, the US Gulf Coast or Saudi, we're very well positioned. It'll take almost twice as long to get a ship through the Panama Canal and over to Asian markets coming out of the Gulf Coast than out of the coast of BC. So main growth in Asia and in China, that middle class that I talked about earlier, very well positioned here for the industrial heartland. So I think from this standpoint, where we sit relative to markets, time it means money, of course. Another reason that companies would look at our jurisdiction. And then there's a number of other things when companies look at our area. So salt cavern storage. Not all jurisdictions have salt caverns, and so most of you would be familiar with this, but in the industrial heartland and other areas where there's a salt formation, there's a Lotsburg salt formation below the surface in the industrial heartland. Companies drill into that, pump water down and dissolve that salt and pump the brine to the surface over a period of a couple of years, and what you're left with is this impermeable cavern that is perfect for storage of a lot of these sort of value-add energy products. And that is a very capital efficient way to have your storage facilities. So throughout the heartland, there's well over 40 storage caverns. This positions us for all sorts of products being produced with storage capability here. So salt cavern storage is an advantage. All of the industrial cluster benefits that I mentioned earlier about products from one company become inputs to another. And you start building up these sort of economies of scale of a cluster, and you think about things like emergency response. Okay, so now you've got this cluster where you can have collaborative effort on emergency response. You can have collaborative effort on community relations. You can have collaborative effort on things that, as you build the cluster, that creates more efficiencies across the whole spectrum. The land, as I mentioned, pre-approved or pre-zoned heavy industrial land, established supply chain capability. So the oil sands have really helped build up this tremendous capability in the Edmonton region, in the Nisku and Leduc area, in the northeast area of Edmonton. Tremendous fabrication capability, supply chain capability, lots of skilled workforce. Of course, the post-secondary institutions in the region, U of A, NAIT, et cetera, really just adds to the overall value proposition that's offered. And then finally, as I mentioned, community support for additional investments, very strong in our region. So I think a good question to ask, though, is, okay, so we've got all this great stuff going on in the heartland and all this advantage. So why is there only $45 billion of investment and not $450 billion of investment, say, right? I mean, you've got all this great stuff. Why aren't companies just falling over themselves to come into the heartland? And so over the last sort of 6 to 7 years, and primarily in the United States were really savvy in putting together incentive packages that would recognize the deficiency in their jurisdiction for their overall competitive advantage, and how can our jurisdiction, in this case the United States, Gulf Coast, Louisiana, Texas, how can they put together incentive packages for companies so that it'll attract their investment to their jurisdiction, recognizing that once these large-scale value-add investments are in the ground, they're in the ground for decades, right? And they provide economic spin-off for decades. It's not a call center, it's not a warehouse, it is a billions of dollars of capital that has all this spin-off economic activity that will continue to be in the ground and operate for decades. And we know that just from experience here, right? The companies in the heartland that started in the 50s are still going here today. And so the U.S. Gulf Coast in particular, and Pennsylvania and other jurisdictions have really put together really smart incentive packages. And so probably about 5 to 7 years ago, starting to talk to the Alberta government and say, you need to recognize that we've got these great advantages, but yet we're still not winning the investment. We're coming in number 2 every time, right? And, you know, if you're not first, you're last, according to Ricky Bobby in Talladega Nights, right? So it's important to be first in the investment. Coming second doesn't help you. You need to be first. And so you need to put together an overall tax framework or economic framework for the province that is going to put you in the pole position when it comes to investments. And so a number of organizations, and the government of Alberta recognizes this as well, a number of organizations worked with the government of Alberta to say, look, our deficit in terms of competitiveness between a capital investment on the Gulf Coast and a capital investment in Alberta is X amount. We need to close that gap in order to put us in the pole position for investment. And so the NDP government put a program in place called the Petrochemical Diversification Program, PDP, and it was a program that was going to provide up to $500 million in royalty credits for companies if they would come and build a petrochemical facility that upgrade either methane or propane, I think the program was. So it was a great first start, I would say. That program was a good first start. It had some weaknesses to it. One of the weaknesses is you would apply to the program, or one of the weaknesses was, the program's not around anymore, you would apply to the program and then it would go into this sort of black box and then you wouldn't know, it wasn't transparent, and then the government of Alberta would pick one. And so the problem with that is, of course, if you have 10 companies applying for this monies and one gets it, you have 9 companies that you've told to go away and 1 company you've said you want to work with. And that's sort of the opposite of what you're trying to do. You'd rather have the 9 companies say, yeah, we want to work here, and maybe one saying that that's not the jurisdiction for them. And so the current government in December of 2020 rolled out the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, which was a modification to the PDP program where they said, look, we're going to have an open-ended program where if you invest in Alberta and you meet this criteria, you're going to upgrade either the methane or the ethane or the propane, you're going to invest so many hundreds of millions of dollars, you're going to produce petrochemical products or value-add energy products, we are going to provide you with a grant up to about 12% of the eligible capital spread out over the next 3 years after the facility is built. And so if you think about it as an Albertan, you say, well, you know, there's always questions, well, why are we using taxpayer money to attract these investments? Well, in this case, the facility is built before the grant is paid. So all the tax revenue that comes from the construction comes in the door, and then you essentially turn that around and give that to the companies in an incentive to build here. And you create a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the tax revenue generated from the construction is basically used to fund this program to improve the economics for the project. It is taxpayer money that wouldn't have come into the government of Alberta in the absence of the project. So it is as a result of the project. The company then has an improvement on their economics because over the first 3 years, they get about 12% of their capital back. As you know, the first few years of any project are where the real dollars matter. 10, 20 years out, not nearly as effective for your economics. And so this is a program that we think has it's a meaningful incentive for companies. And the other nice thing about it, it's an open-ended program. They're not saying you apply and we will then pick 1 out of 10. It's you come to Alberta, you meet this criteria, you build a facility, you're going to have this incentive. And so we think globally, when we're talking with companies, we think this is meaningful. We think this will help companies get over the finish line. And we're very hopeful that this will sort of close that competitive gap between what we're seeing in Gulf Coast and what we're seeing in Alberta. And hopefully we see tremendous growth in Alberta and the industrial heartland as a result. And again, it's not just that incentive program. It is the entire value proposition in here in Alberta, but it all helps, right? When you're competing for capital globally, it all helps. And so where does that lead us for growth? What are we seeing for growth? So we're in this fairly unique sort of position in that we're talking with companies at the very, very, very early stages of a project. So the very pointy end of that spear, what are they looking at? And we get a sort of a market view of what companies are looking at, where interests are. And so what we're seeing, we're having conversations with companies that are looking at methane through to methanol, companies who are looking at ethane to ethylene and on to derivatives from there, similarly with propane. And then a number of companies looking at specialty chemicals and value-add products from our using chemical processes from our cheap natural gas through to a number of things, perhaps animal protein or biofuels. We are talking about small modular nuclear reactors. I think that's a ways away, but certainly we could see in the drive for zero-emission electricity, nuclear may play a role going forward. Alberta's has an interesting position with respect to lithium processing. Significant lithium deposits and resources in Alberta. And there's conversations we're having with companies on municipal solid waste energy, renewable power, even just, I'm going to say green power from producing electricity and then using carbon capture and storage to have a lower carbon footprint. So, we're talking with companies early on in the life cycle of their project. We're seeing conversation around these areas, and it's all driven by the value proposition and the competitive advantage that I mentioned, and primarily that low-cost feedstock. And what we're seeing now, that access to carbon capture and storage really creates a 1-2 punch for us. And there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen as well. You hear hydrogen all the time, conversation about the hydrogen economy. So the industrial heartland is, as the interest of hydrogen grows, as the hydrogen economy grows, we're very, very well positioned here. And on this graph, I don't expect you to see all the numbers, but the story basically is at the bottom. There's the second from the bottom. That's Canada Natural Gas plus CCS. We are essentially, next to Russia, the lowest cost producer of hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen in the world. And that's driven by, again, low cost natural gas, carbon capture and storage. So we can produce some of the lowest cost, low carbon hydrogen in the world that really positions this jurisdiction to participate in the hydrogen economy. And now companies around the world, and Japan in particular, Japan is saying, okay, look, we have most of our electricity, or a good portion of our electricity generation is from coal-fired power generation. And they're looking at taking ammonia and injecting that into their coal-fired power to displace some of the coal that they're using to reduce their overall carbon footprint, because ammonia is nitrogen and hydrogen. So you burn ammonia, and there's no CO2 coming off of that. So they want to use that to reduce their overall greenhouse gas footprint from their coal-fired power generation. So Japanese companies are looking around the world, actually, how can they get access to ammonia to import into Japan to help offset their greenhouse gas emissions. And so we think the industrial heartland is positioned for either ammonia exports or other liquid organic hydrogen exports, because compressing and shipping hydrogen around the world is very expensive and probably a long way off. But carriers like liquid organic hydrogen or ammonia, those happen today. And ammonia moves around the world, seaborne trade, 20 million tons or whatever the number is. So that happens today, and it is an energy-dense way to move hydrogen around the world. And so we have companies that are looking at ammonia production for import into Japan. And so what have we heard recently? There's been a lot of activity in the industrial heartland, a number of announcements. And these are just public announcements. So Suncor and ATCO came out last year and said, look, we're looking collectively at a hydrogen facility, clean hydrogen facility in the industrial heartland. Shell and Mitsubishi had a joint announcement that they're looking at an ammonia facility coupled with the carbon capture and storage capability that's provided by Shell. And that would be a low carbon ammonia project, again, to access, in essence, the hydrogen economy. Itochu is a massive Japanese trading company, and Petronas, the Malaysian state energy company. They've announced that they also are working with a Canadian midstream company looking at building and constructing and producing ammonia, low carbon ammonia in the industrial heartland for the same reasons that I mentioned, access international markets that are looking for ammonia to displace their overall carbon footprint. A great announcement from Dow, I don't know how many months ago now, but Dow came out and announced the world's first net zero ethylene production facility. They're looking at Alberta's industrial heartland at their facility in Fort Saskatchewan. Now, that's not a final investment decision, and they haven't disclosed what the capital would be. But I mean, these are massive complexes, the billions and billions of dollars. And the exciting thing about this announcement, or at least Dow giving a very strong signal that they're looking at our region, is that Dow, of course, a leader in their field and a world-leading petrochemical company, when they come out to the world and say, look, we're looking at the industrial heartland to build our net zero, the first net zero ethylene production complex, that sends a tremendous signal to the world that this is a jurisdiction where companies can meet their economic objectives as well as their environmental objectives. And so it's a great story for us, and we're really looking forward to Dow continue to progress that project, and hopefully they can reach final investment decision. A company named Cielo came out and said, look, we've bought some land in the industrial heartland to look at waste to diesel, a way of, again, reducing methane emissions from municipal waste, processing up municipal waste through to diesel. Again, I think it was a really good news story. Shell has had a number of announcements, a couple of them. They've announced a large solar farm. They also announced a large carbon capture and storage project called Shell Polaris. I want to be clear, that project still is dependent on final investment decision, which is dependent on the government of Alberta awarding carbon capture and storage hub status as part of their policy, and that they'll be doing that hopefully in the near future. Pembina and TC Energy also came out and said, look, we're going to combine and look at a carbon capture, carbon grid, carbon storage grid, and carbon storage system across the province. And there was an interesting announcement recently, within the last month. Fortune Minerals are looking at, they are studying a cobalt sulfate refinery in the industrial heartland to participate in the lithium-ion battery market that is growing, of course, for all the EVs and electric vehicles, demand for electric vehicles that you're seeing around the world. So these are all public announcements. They are all announcements of companies that are, seriously looking at projects. Either they're seriously looking, or they've made final investment decisions, or they're on their way to a final investment decision. And I think it just illustrates that you've got world-class companies looking at the region, and so the value proposition that's offered between the low-cost feedstocks, all those other advantages, carbon capture and storage, plus the government supports, it really is leading to a robust investment climate, and we're quite optimistic about what the future holds here in the industrial heartland. So I have been talking now nonstop. We've got, on the clock here, we've got 18 minutes. So why don't we have a conversation? Whatever questions you might have, I'll try to answer as best I can, and let's have a dialogue about Alberta and the industrial heartland.
Mark, regarding the ammonia, aren't there any concerns about NOx and stuff like that?
Yeah, so great. So the question is, what about NOx emissions with ammonia, or even NOx emissions with hydrogen? I mean, your flame tip characteristics are going to change when you're burning hydrogen, or hydrogen blend in natural gas, and how does that affect NOx and all of those things? So the answer is, your NOx emissions will be impacted. I don't know exactly by how much, but there's trade-offs in all cases. So companies will need to look at their overall greenhouse gas footprint relative to the NOx emissions in their airshed, and balance all those out. There's always trade-offs when you're looking at environmental projects. You just have to decide what trade-offs are most important to you. So yeah, absolutely. So burning ammonia in coal-fired power, there'll be an impact to NOx, and burning hydrogen as a blend will also have an impact to NOx. And all of that will need to be looked at and figured out. I also get a question all the time around ammonia. Well, wait a sec, shipping ammonia around the world, isn't ammonia toxic? Yeah, ammonia's toxic. That's right. But it's managed, it's shipped around the world, it's managed, right? So companies learn to manage these things, systems are in place, and it is a seaborne trade as we speak. And so learning how to manage these things, learning how to manage NOx and all those things is all part of the conversation, for sure. Hi, we've got a question down here.
Mark, thanks a lot for your presentation. Do you think it's realistic that with a government plan that on tax that you can double that $45 billion investment? And then the second question, do you think pipelines are still a pinch point for the heartland development?
Yeah, okay, so great. So first of all, will we be able to double that investment? So when I started with the Heartland, I started in 2017, so I'm just coming up on 5 years. And we looked at projects that we realistically think make competitive sense, companies that we know are looking at things, and what do we think could happen in the heartland. And we sort of compiled a list of projects, and we looked at sort of probabilities, and we said, we think it is not beyond the realm of possibility to get an extra $30 billion of investment by 2030. So that would move you. At that time, we were a $40 billion jurisdiction, and I was sort of saying, I think we could do $70 billion by 2030, which is a pretty tall order, given that, from the 2050s to 2017, you're at 40 billion. To go from 40 to 70 by 2030, that's a pretty tall order. But, I think, look at the projects that are in the pipeline here. So Inter Pipeline is finishing up their polypropylene facility. That's 5 billion. So we're 5 billion of the way there. So we're 25 billion left to go. You've got a world-scale net zero polyethylene production or ethylene production complex that Dow is looking at. They haven't disclosed the capital, but it's a huge number. So you take that, and then look at the number of hydrogen announcements and ammonia plants that are looking. And if say each of those complexes are, close to $1 billion, you get a few of those. Now all of a sudden you've got another 5-ish billion to go, or 5 to 10 billion to go. So you're starting to close that gap. So is it realistic to get to 70 billion by 2030? It's a stretch goal, for sure. I think with the interest we're seeing, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities, let me say that. Then with respect to pipelines, so a few comments. So the marginal barrels of propane, for example, move by rail. And so rail is a key infrastructure for the industrial heartland, and will continue to be a key infrastructure component in getting products out of the heartland. So propane moves by rail to the coast. Propane moves by rail to, the West Coast into the United States. Rail will continue to be a key infrastructure piece for us and very important to the growth in the heartland, for sure. And even when you're looking to export other products out of Rupert, if you want to grow exports into Asia, rail is going to be a key piece of infrastructure. With respect to pipelines, now around natural gas, let's take LNG, Coastal GasLink, for example. I mean, we view export of LNG as a real positive for our region, because if the methane can be exported and the liquids can be separated, so the ethane, propane, butane, pentane, if those can all be kept in Western Canada, you have incremental low-cost feedstocks for value-add petrochemical growth. So we think it's a real plus to get natural gas out in the form of LNG, but egress of energy products is going to be a pinch point for Alberta always. If egress was not a pinch point, I think you wouldn't see the discount that we're seeing on our energy projects. So the answer is yes, I think energy egress will always be a challenge for Alberta. Hi.
Hi, I was wondering if you could go over the logic again, why ethane, methane, and propane, and all the ethanes are cheaper here in Alberta. Why we produce them cheaper, and why it can't be done the exact same way in the States?
Yeah, so the States, so it's all interconnected, and it all has to do with markets and where your markets are, right? So the United States has tremendous production of oil and natural gas and propane and ethane, and all of those things. It's all come with, as horizontal drilling and fracking and all that was developed, it really created this energy superpower now in the United States where they export energy. It was up until 2014, they weren't even allowed to export energy products, right? They were only importing, right? And so, the United States lifted the moratorium on energy exports. They're now the largest, or definitely one of the largest exporters of propane and energy products and LNG in the world. And so you've got your markets, and your pricing is based in the Gulf Coast. So it's really a conversation around how do you get Alberta products to the market. And so if your price at Gulf Coast is $5 a gigajoule or $5 an MMBTU, you're going to get $5 an MMBTU at the Henry Hub in the Gulf Coast. So, but you need to get it there, which means if I'm going to pay you for your natural gas in Alberta, I'm only going to pay you what I can get for it in the Gulf Coast, less what it's going to cost me to transport. And so that's why you're going to have a discounted price always in Alberta if your market is being made in the Gulf. And so yes, the companies in the U.S. produce natural gas, and they get Henry Hub pricing for it. And if they wanted to deliver into Alberta, which they don't because there's lots of natural gas here, they would actually have to offer a discounted price, because why would you buy American natural gas when you can buy natural gas right next door? But if you're a producer of natural gas and I can get it in Henry Hub for X, I'm going to get it for the price, less transportation. And so it's all around the logistics of moving these energy products around. Now, I want to be clear. I mean, that's on balance. There's always days where there's infrastructure blips and temperature changes and all that stuff. But on average, just the transportation component of getting to market is what is going to create a discounted price. So if you're going to build a petrochemical facility, you can build in Alberta and get a discounted feedstock. Hi.
On that same note, is there a driver to bring any of that advanced petrochemical refining to the heartland as opposed to shipping to the Gulf Coast and back?
Yeah.
Or is that ship sailed?
Yeah, no. So if I understand your question, you're asking about, value-add petrochemical facilities. Are those facilities interested in building in the heartland relative to Gulf Coast? No, absolutely. Let's take one that's under construction right now. So the IPL facility, so Inter Pipeline, is building a $5 billion facility in the industrial heartland, and I'm sure most of you are aware and might even work there. And so that's taking the low-cost propane through to propylene, through to polypropylene. And polypropylene is a plastic used in vehicles. Your currency, Canadian currency, is made out of polypropylene. And so that is an example of a project where when they look around the world where it makes sense for them, they're saying right here in Alberta, because that low-cost propane is providing a competitive advantage, I can rail it into the manufacturing belt in the United States for essentially the same rail cost as if I railed it up from the U.S. Gulf Coast. So I can get my product into the manufacturing belt in the U.S. for cheaper than what the U.S. Gulf Coast can, because of my feedstock and my rail costs are similar on the rail portion. And so that creates a competitive advantage. And there you go. So that company said, look, I believe this competitive advantage is sustainable. I believe it's going to make sense for us to get a positive return on capital for all the other advantages and the total value proposition and the government supports that are being provided. And so that's an example of a project that has done just that. They have built a petrochemical facility based on the competitive advantages in the industrial heartland. And so I don't think that ship has sailed at all. I think more companies are looking at it. I think it's a real advantage for us. In fact, we're hopeful to see substantial more investment to capture all those advantages that I mentioned. Down here again.
Apologies for coming back with another question.
No, it's good. It's good.
I didn't hear that you mentioned much about the labor pool.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an advantage, and the high cost of labor in Alberta compared to other places, is that a disadvantage?
Great question. So you can tell that I'm a bit of a salesman, right? So when we're around the world talking to companies, we're talking about all the advantages and the exciting things, and we work with them to help them figure out what makes sense. And so when a company's looking, they are figuring all this out. And so one of the weaknesses that we have is the capital cost of building in Alberta. It's a competitive weakness, for sure. And we know this. Companies look at building in our jurisdiction versus, so first of all, most of our comparisons are with Gulf Coast, right? That's a good benchmark to compare. And so we look at Gulf Coast and we do comparisons, and yeah, you know what? Our capital costs to build here are a little bit higher than Gulf Coast. So that's one weakness for us. But I would say compared to Gulf Coast, we're actually not bad. The issue is when you're competing with Saudi or you're competing with China. Your CapEx is nowhere near what it would cost to build in Saudi or China. And so that is a real competitive weakness for North America as a whole. Our capital costs are much higher than other jurisdictions. And so, yeah, you have this great operating cost advantage, and you know how all the economics works, right? Your cash flows in year 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 are worth way more than your cash flows way out. So your CapEx is one of the key inputs to your economic model. And not only that, when you're going to your board for approval to build a project, it's a lot easier to go for $700 million than it is for $1 billion, say. Just psychologically as a board. Wait a sec, I'm going to approve $1 billion over here when I could do it over here for $700 million, for example. I'm not saying that's the difference. I'm just saying, you know, when you're talking to a board and they're looking at various jurisdictions around the world, CapEx is a sensitive number. It's very important on the economics, and it's very sensitive when you're looking at approvals for your project. So absolutely, yep, capital is a weakness for us. Is it driven by just labor, though? There's a lot of factors. You talk to the big, EPCM companies, lots of factors, right? Scheduling, strategies on how to build winterization, all that stuff. So there's lots of factors that go into it. But certainly, in general, capital costs are high in Alberta, yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Does that relate to the 12% of NDP?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Another question,
Yeah.
to add on, is the regulatory costs or the utility costs. Because I used to work for a company in the US, in Canada, and there was a big discrepancy
Yeah.
in even operation
Yep.
costs versus the Americans and
Yep.
things. I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Right.
I think safety-wise,
Yep.
we may be further ahead, but there might be a greater cost there.
So if everyone could hear the question was twofold. The question was, okay, is the capital costs, higher capital costs in Alberta, is that why there's a 12% reimbursement of capital by the government of Alberta through the Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program? Is that where the 12% came from? So that was one question. And then the other question was, is part of the high capital cost and maybe even operating cost a regulatory cost? How much of the regulatory piece is adding to the cost competitiveness of Alberta versus US? Did I understand both those questions properly? Okay, so on the 12%, the government of Alberta and Alberta Energy did a lot of work on this, and it would have been all factors, right? So they would look at the entire value proposition and the entire economics of building a facility in Alberta versus a competing jurisdiction. So you look at what your feedstock costs are, what your build costs are, what your market netbacks are, access to markets. You look at the whole value proposition and then you say, okay, what's my difference in present value on this investment? And how do I close the gap on present value? And that's how that number sort of came up with. So, and they wanted it to be meaningful, right? It has to be a meaningful assistance to companies. It can't just be a token, look, we're here to support you, but by the way, it doesn't mean anything economically. It has to be meaningful. The government recognized that, and so that's sort of how the 12% came up. I mean, there was lots of analysis by Alberta Energy, lots of conversations with stakeholders. So it wasn't just labor or the capital cost, it was the entire analysis. And it also included incentive packages offered in other jurisdictions, right? Because it's the whole value proposition here relative to another jurisdiction, because we're in competition for capital, right? So that's answers that one. And then the second cost was around the regulatory component. And you know what? It is, I'm going to say, another competitive challenge in Canada is the uncertainty associated with the regulatory process. The longer your process, the more uncertainty you have until your project is generating cash flow, right? And so one of the weaknesses in Canada is, Alberta and Canada, is the length of time for that regulatory process. I think once you're up and running as well, there's probably some challenges from a cost perspective, but I don't think that was enough to sort of swing the needle on your profitability of an organization. But certainly, it's recognized that the streamlining of the regulatory framework is a critical component of competitiveness. And it's largely to do with risk mitigation. And I'm talking about risk from a company standpoint. You are putting capital out, and the faster you can get cash flows into your business, the less risk you have on the capital out. So the longer it takes you to get all the regulatory approvals and the longer it takes to get that project up and running, the more risk you have on capital. And so that is a part of the equation that companies consider, and it is recognized by the government, and there are concerted efforts for red tape reduction, for streamlining regulatory approvals, and that's all conversations that are ongoing as we speak between various stakeholders. So great question. Thank you. Got a question way down here.
Good morning, Mike. Well, good morning, Mark. Thanks
Yeah,
for your
good morning.
presentation. I was wondering if you could comment on Alberta's ability to take, in light of recent geopolitical events, Alberta's ability to take market share of oil and gas products in Europe, and what would it take? And if you've seen some interest in that recently.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Very relevant question today. So I'm going to try to answer that. I'm also going to add to it. I was asked yesterday by one of my board members around, is the conflict in the Ukraine, is that having any impact on investors currently looking? And so I'll answer sort of that first to give some color. Like right now, we don't have any Russian companies operating in the heartland and Ukraine companies. And of the investors that are looking in the heartland, we don't have a large portfolio of potential Russian investments. So I'd say direct, immediate impact in our region based on the war on Ukraine is probably quite mooted or non-existent. I think your question's more along the lines of, what's the long-term, as the world turns towards energy security as a priority, because I think over the few decades in an integrated global economy, we have these integrated systems where energy security has maybe not been the number one priority or has maybe had less of a focus. And now, with the conflict, energy security, is there an opportunity for Alberta to capture market share as countries look for energy security? So I do know that, Europe, for the last while, we have been getting inquiries through the federal government around how can Alberta provide energy products to Europe. And so there's inquiries for those things. We need to put a little bit of realism on this and be realistic. It takes a decade to get an LNG facility up and running if you're lucky. And so all of that infrastructure and all of the build to get Alberta energy products to Europe, it's a long, long time. And so maybe there's interest for Alberta to capture market share, sure. Is the infrastructure and the regulatory systems in place to capture that quickly? I'd say no. In my opinion, I think that's a long time coming. So maybe the shift towards energy security, just in general, like maybe the Americans say, look, energy security is now a higher priority for us. We want to shift more of our focus to Alberta supports. Maybe more North American markets would make sense because the energy mix shifts and there's less energy products coming into the United States. So maybe there's a rebalancing where there's more focus on Alberta. I'm going to say maybe. But direct supply of energy products into Europe from Canada is a long, long ways away. And in the end, I don't even know if it'll be competitive.